This is a SiriusXM Patriot special report.
Welcome back to Patriot Special Report here on SiriusXM Patriot Channel 125. My name is Tim Young. If you want to get in on the conversation today, it's 1-866-95-PATRIOT, 1-866-957-2874. As we spoke earlier in the hour with Dov Hikind, the president of Americans Against Anti-Semitism, he was talking about all the great leaps and bounds in peace that the Trump administration has accomplished over the past 4 years, but especially in the last 6 months. We are seeing historic peace in the Middle East, and here to talk about it is Brooke Goldstein. I hope I'm saying that right. Executive Director for the Lawfare Project. Brooke, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Yes, you said it right.
I always worry. It could be Stein, it could be Steen, and I like kick myself. I usually pick the wrong one when it's a 50-50 chance, by the way. Let's talk about this. So this is absolutely, it's groundbreaking, it's historic, and it's totally blown off by the media. This trip by Secretary Pompeo over to Israel. Can you explain to everyone how significant this is and what it really means for the world?
All right. Absolutely. I think it is exactly what you said, truly historic. I think this final trip to the Middle East is really, a fitting end to his tenure as Secretary of State. Just look at the peace deals that they have brokered between Israel and now I believe it's 3 Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. He brought together apparently the Prime Minister of Israel and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who is the most important Arab leader in the world, for an in-person meeting. I think this alone would have been unthinkable a few years ago. He's acted with extreme moral clarity in reaffirming Israel's right to sovereignty over its own land. And I think that people often forget what a big deal it was when the United States moved its embassy to Jerusalem, and recognized the Golan Heights as sovereign Israeli territory. All these smart foreign policy people all over the world told us this would result in an all-out war throughout the Middle East, and literally the opposite has been true. Peace has basically broke out throughout the region, so it just goes to show all those foreign policy wonks were wrong all along. A two-state solution is not the be-all, end-all. It is possible for Israel to have peace with its neighbors, and it has nothing to do with the creation of another Islamic state in a sea of failed Islamic dictatorships.
Yeah, it's just remarkable, everything that's happening there. There's an article on this in NBC News. Pompeo recasts U.S. policy towards Israel with the visit to a settlement winery, which is just wild, absolutely wild. But there's something that is brought up in this article that a lot of people hear a lot about, but probably don't understand. And I'd love for you to dig into it a little bit and explain it to folks. There's something called the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, that really is trying to harm Israel as much as people can with import and export. And we hear about it a lot. We hear, I believe it was AOC and Ilhan Omar are supporters of this, and of course Linda Sarsour and folks like that. Can you explain the BDS movement and what it really means?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say we actually represent the wine visited Sagot Winery in a series of legal battles around the world. And one of the most substantive things that the secretary did on this trip was codify that U.S. policy regarding products that come from Jewish-owned businesses in Judea and Samaria are going to be marked as made in Israel, which is just a legal recognition of, or a customs recognition of the facts on the ground. And this obviously angered the so-called BDS movement. I want to be very clear. What the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement is advocating for is illegal commercial discrimination against persons or companies because of their national origin. The equivalent would be saying, I have a problem with the Chinese government's handling of COVID. Therefore, I'm going to go to my local Chinese businessman and I'm going to discriminate against him because I'm going to blame him for the alleged crimes of a foreign government. Or I have a problem with Iranian nuclear policy, so I'm going to go turn around and discriminate against this local Iranian businessman. That's exactly what Rashida Tlaib and her ilk support: illegal commercial discrimination against Israeli people because of Israeli Jews, because of their religion, because of their national origin, because they project the perceived foreign policy crimes of a foreign government on these citizens. And that's just pure bigotry. So anyone who says that they're pro-BDS, what they're really saying is they're pro-discrimination against Jewish-owned businesses because of the national origin and the religious identity of that owner.
Yeah, it's wild. And when you find out that folks behind, like Linda Sarsour, who was behind the Women's March, and folks like her who are running these large-scale operations and pushing this BDS movement and what it means is just very, very incredibly scary for modern times.
Yeah, especially when you see that the biggest victims of the so-called BDS movement are the Palestinian Arabs themselves, because what was really emphasized by this trip, and I think what ties it in nicely, is the true path to peace is economic interdependence. That's what all these peace deals are about. Economic deals between countries, which would increase the likelihood of peace and decrease the likelihood that these two populations will go to war with each other, because they're dependent on each other, okay? And so at the end of the day, what the BDS movement is trying to do is make it so that Israel does not do business with its neighbors, and to punish those, for example, Palestinians that make a living in Israel. So it's not only is it a racist movement, but it's one that is aimed to destroy and to perpetuate further war and conflict.
I'm going to ask a theoretical or a 50,000-foot question. I can't figure out which one it is. I'm not a smart guy once in a while here. Anti-Semitism is clearly on the rise in America, clearly on the rise internationally. What do you think is causing that now? Because it scares me.
Well, that's not, that's the million-dollar question. Anti-Semitism is really one of those diseases of the human condition that has existed for way too long. The Jewish community is the oldest and most persecuted minority community in the world, and Jew hatred has become systemic. It has become, again, acceptable in polite society, and what this is indicative of really is the fact that our democracies are not healthy. When you see the Jewish people being attacked, it's a sign of something bad to come. We are the canary in the coal miner's tunnel, so to speak. So I think it's a symptom that our democracies are failing, they are sick, and we must be attentive to this. We must fight against Jew hatred right now, and we must make sure that the Jewish community as a minority community, especially in this day and age, is afforded the same type of civil rights protections as other minority communities. And that is what someone like Rashida Tlaib does not want. She does not want Jews to be afforded the same type of protections under law that prevent against unlawful discrimination.
I just, as someone who has studied history, as someone who I have befriended recently, I have lots of Jewish friends, but a man who helped liberate Dachau, who is 95 years old, who fought in World War II. The fact that this hatred continues after, this guy was, not to speak too much about my own personal history here and my knowledge of things, but this man is a war hero, a very brave, tough guy at 95 still. And when he talks about what he saw there, his entire demeanor changes, and he was horrified, and he still is to this day, about what happened. And the fact that I fear that a lot of folks are okay with, ignoring history and potentially letting it happen again and letting it repeat itself, which we, as a kid growing up, you're like, oh, this could never happen. But I see this rise in hatred, and it truly scares me to my core.
Well, look, let's put a silver lining on it, okay? So for centuries, I think we've also seen the discrimination and oppression against women, against Blacks, against other minority groups. This was all tolerated. But because of the efforts of civil rights activists today, this is no longer the case. An international conversation has taken place to free women and to free minorities from bigotry and bad behavior, and is no longer socially acceptable to engage in that type of racism. I think we need now to have the same conversation about the eradication of Jew hatred. And it's as much as, calling out the Jew haters as it is focusing on the empowerment and liberation of the Jewish community themselves from centuries of persecution and discrimination, which we have internalized and for which we now blame ourselves. So there's a lot of work that we have to do to end the Jew hatred, which has really become very structural and systemic and really a fixture of European and society and American society for hundreds of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Brooke Goldstein, you're the executive director of the Lawfare Project, which is a very important organization, the lawfareproject.org. Can you tell us a little bit about your work over there?
Sure. I run the only Jewish civil rights litigation fund in the world. You can liken us to the Jewish ACLU. We file seminal civil rights cases on behalf of Jewish communities around the world. We have a network of over 400 lawyers. We have filed, I think, almost 100 cases now in the last 4 years. We're a young group. And we are also obviously a nonprofit. So if the empowerment of the Jewish community and the safeguarding of the Jewish community as a minority community is important to you, definitely please look up the lawfareproject.org and definitely consider supporting our work.
Absolutely. The lawfareproject.org. That's Executive Director Brooke Goldstein. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.